The summer heat clung to the plantation like a fever the year the new cook arrived, a quiet young woman with steady eyes that seemed to hold storms no one else could see. From the moment she stepped onto the grounds, something in the air shifted, a tension that hummed beneath the creaking porch boards and drifted through the weeping willow branches. The lady of the house felt it too, though she pretended not to. She watched the cook from the upper balcony, her gaze following the woman's movements as if drawn by an invisible thread she had no strength or desire to sever. The plantation was a place of routines carved in stone, yet the cook's presence introduced a subtle unease, the kind that made candles flicker even without a draft. The wife found excuses to linger near the kitchen, claiming headaches, checking on supper, pretending to supervise. But each time, it was the cook's soft voice and quiet bravery that pulled her deeper into a world where forbidden feelings grew like wild vines in the dark. Their connection began wordlessly, in exchanged glances and shared silences, unraveling the loneliness the wife had carried for years. But secrets on a plantation never stayed buried long. Servants whispered. Shadows lengthened. And behind the polished smile of the plantation owner, something colder stirred, something watching, waiting. He noticed the unusual warmth in his wife's eyes, the late hours she kept, the hushed footsteps returning from the kitchen. The air thickened with suspicion, and the walls themselves seemed to listen. Every night, as the cicadas screamed and the lanterns burned low, the wife felt the pull toward the woman who made her feel alive for the first time in years. But beneath that fragile beauty lurked a danger she refused to name, as if acknowledging it would summon it into flesh. And so, in a house built on secrets and silence, love curled itself into the dark corners, unaware that death had already begun to move toward them, slowly, quietly, with the patience of something inevitable. The arrival of the new cook was not marked by ceremony or announcement, yet her presence shifted the entire rhythm of the plantation in a way no one could quite explain. She stepped off the wagon with a calmness that contrasted sharply with the tense, watchful atmosphere around her. Her movements were composed, almost graceful, as though she had learned long ago how to occupy as little space as possible while still holding onto a shard of dignity. Her eyes were steady, observant, quietly taking in the sprawling fields, the main house looming in the distance, and the silent hierarchy that dictated every breath taken on the land. Those who lived and worked under the sun could sense something different about her, something that didn't belong to the harshness of the plantation's daily grind. She was not loud or defiant, her difference was far more subtle, carried in the soft but unwavering way she lifted her chin, in the careful thought behind each word she spoke, in the unspoken strength that radiated from her without permission. When she was led into the kitchen for the first time, the air itself felt like it paused, as though the bricks and wooden beams recognized an energy they had been missing. She inspected the space the way a person studies a battlefield, calculating, assessing, mapping out where harm could come from and where small moments of peace might be found. There was something hauntingly composed in the way she organized the kitchen within minutes, setting pots back to their rightful places, placing vegetables in tidy rows, and sharpening knives with the precision of someone who found solace in order. She carried herself with an inner quiet that unsettled some of the other servants, not because she sought to challenge them but because her presence illuminated the weight of their own exhaustion. But it was the plantation wife who felt the shift most sharply. Watching from her upstairs window, she spotted the new cook moving with a certain gentleness that pulled at something buried deep in her chest. It was not admiration exactly, nor curiosity alone. It was a feeling she didn't yet have a name for, a feeling that warmed her even through the thick summer air. She found herself returning to the window without meaning to, her eyes following the cook as she moved between the herb garden and the kitchen door. The wife sensed the beginning of something she could not control, something that hovered at the edge of thought like a soft but dangerous whisper. She didn't know why the sight of this new woman unsettled her or why the world suddenly felt as though it had tilted slightly off balance. All she knew was that with the cook's arrival, a quiet shift had begun, one that would ripple outward until it consumed everything. Unspoken curiosity began as nothing more than a fleeting glance, the kind a person gives when something unfamiliar brushes against the edges of their awareness. For the plantation wife, it started with a simple question that rose in her mind without permission. Why did the new cook seem to move differently from everyone else? She could not help noticing the quiet certainty in her steps, the soft restraint with which she worked, the air of calm she carried even in a place built on tension. What should have been an ordinary working presence soon became a quiet magnet that drew the wife's attention again and again. She found herself thinking of the cook at odd moments, during breakfast, during the long hours of sewing, even when she was meant to be minding her husband's business. A subtle pull formed between them, invisible but unmistakable, and the wife felt it growing stronger with each passing day. She began inventing excuses to move through the kitchen, though she told herself she was simply monitoring household duties. She lingered near the doorway, watching the cook slice vegetables with precise, careful hands. She slowed her steps just to catch the soft hum of a tune the cook sometimes sang under her breath. The wife observed the young woman's expressions, the way her face softened while stirring a pot or how her eyes brightened briefly when she tasted something she was proud of. These trivial moments began carving themselves into the wife's memory, as though her mind was trying to preserve something delicate before the world broke it. The cook noticed her presence, of course, but she never reacted with fear or discomfort. Instead, she acknowledged the wife with small nods, polite tones, and a quiet awareness that hinted she understood more than she let on. That calm acceptance only deepened the wife's interest. She found herself yearning to ask questions, to understand the quiet confidence hidden beneath the cook's reserved exterior. Yet she held her tongue, because curiosity of this nature was dangerous in a house where every whisper traveled, where secrets were traded like currency, and where stepping outside invisible lines could ruin lives. Still, the wife could not stop herself from seeking glimpses, from pausing by the stairs to watch the cook carry water, from offering soft compliments that came out sounding more intimate than intended. The unspoken curiosity became a quiet ache in her chest, a feeling of wanting to be near someone who made the world feel less hollow. It unsettled her, frightened her even, but she could no longer ignore it. Something in the cook's presence stirred old parts of her she thought had long died, parts that craved warmth, connection, and meaning. And though no words had yet been exchanged beyond the necessary, the air between them had begun to shift, heavy with unspoken longing neither fully understood but both could feel growing with every heartbeat. The quiet bond that formed between them did not begin with bold declarations or risky gestures but with the smallest moments, the kind that pass unnoticed by everyone except the two people living inside them. It began late in the evenings, when the rest of the household retired and the kitchen softened into a sanctuary of dim lantern glow and cooling embers. The wife found reasons to wander down after dark, telling herself she needed water or had forgotten something important. In truth, she was drawn by a pull she could not name, a desire to step into the warm hush of the kitchen where the cook remained, finishing her duties in a peaceful solitude rare for such a place. Their first true exchange was accidental, sparked by a spilled ladle of broth and the wife's attempt to help clean it. Their hands brushed, not meaningfully, not intentionally, but enough to make both of them freeze for a heartbeat too long. The cook apologized softly, her voice steady yet tinged with something almost fragile. The wife waved it off, though her pulse fluttered like a trapped bird. It was a simple moment, but it left an imprint that lingered in both their minds. After that, it became harder to pretend indifference. The conversations that followed were cautious at first. The wife asked polite questions about recipes or the day's meals, but beneath the surface lay a hunger for connection she had kept buried for years. The cook answered with gentle honesty, never overstepping but offering just enough warmth to ease the wife's loneliness. Slowly, their talks grew longer, stretching past midnight into hours neither should have risked. They shared fragments of their lives, guarded pieces of truth, carefully testing the boundaries of trust. The cook spoke of the gardens she used to tend and the songs her mother taught her. The wife confessed her fear of the vast emptiness in her marriage, a fear she had never dared speak aloud. Their friendship became a refuge, a fragile space stitched together by shared moments too delicate to survive daylight. They began to laugh quietly together, to exchange knowing looks when passing in the hallway, to notice the tiny details in each other's expressions. What grew between them was not openly acknowledged, yet it gained strength in silence, weaving itself into the fabric of their days. Each night deepened the connection, drawing them closer in ways neither fully understood but both felt undeniably. No one else noticed the subtle shift in their behavior, the ease with which they moved around each other, the invisible thread binding them. But in a place where secrets never stayed hidden, this gentle bond born of stolen time and whispered truths was already becoming something far more dangerous than friendship, something that carried both hope and the seeds of tragedy. Suspicion crept into the plantation owner's mind long before he had any solid reason to feel it, beginning as a faint irritation he couldn't quite place. He first noticed something different in his wife during supper one evening, a softness in her expression, a distracted lightness that had been absent for years. She smiled to herself at odd moments, as if her thoughts were no longer tethered to the room she occupied. At first, he dismissed it as one of her passing moods, but the change persisted. She excused herself from meals earlier than usual, returned from the kitchen with flushed cheeks, and seemed almost restless when he questioned her about trivial matters. These small deviations from her usual demeanor stirred an uncomfortable curiosity inside him, prompting him to watch her more closely. He began paying attention to her movements, the way she lingered on the back staircase or took longer trips to the garden that led conveniently past the kitchen. He noticed she no longer asked him about business or sought his approval on household matters. Instead, she appeared to recoil from him in subtle ways, stepping away quickly when he entered a room or avoiding his gaze during conversations. These little signs fed his irritation, convincing him that something in his home was slipping beyond his control. What troubled him most, however, was the unfamiliar sound of her laughter drifting through the hallway late at night. It was faint, almost hesitant, but unmistakable. The kind of laugh she hadn't shared with him since the early years of their marriage. The sound gnawed at him, raising questions he refused to voice. He attempted to catch her in the act of wandering the house after dark, but each time he approached, the laughter stopped and the corridor returned to silence, leaving him to wonder if he was imagining it. His suspicion sharpened further when he noticed the cook. She moved through the house with an air of quiet confidence he found unsettling. She never met his eyes unless necessary, and even then, her gaze carried a steadiness that made him uncomfortable. He began to question why his wife praised the cook's meals so often, why she defended her when small mistakes were pointed out, and why she chose to stand near the kitchen doorway during afternoons when she had no need to be there. The more he watched, the more convinced he became that something unspoken was taking place under his own roof. He could not yet define it, could not articulate the shape of his suspicion, but it tightened inside him like a knot he couldn't loosen. A man accustomed to control, he sensed it slipping inch by inch, and his growing unease quietly darkened into resentment. The moment a servant overheard that whisper, the fragile secrecy wrapped around the two women began to unravel. It happened on a humid night when the air hung heavy and the corridors were quiet enough to catch every creak of the old floorboards. The cook and the wife were in the kitchen, speaking in low tones that hovered just above a murmur. Their conversation wasn't bold or reckless, but there was a tenderness in their voices, an emotional weight that could not be mistaken for ordinary household talk. A servant passing through the hallway paused when she heard the wife's voice soften in a way it never did with anyone else. Curious and cautious, she edged closer, careful not to let her shadow stretch across the doorway. What she heard was brief, just a handful of words spoken with a warmth that did not belong in a kitchen after midnight. The cook said something about wishing she could stay in moments like this, and the wife answered with a whisper threaded with longing. It wasn't proof of anything scandalous by itself, but the tone, the silence that followed, and the soft sound of breath held between them all carried an intimacy that could not be ignored. The servant stepped back quickly, her heart pounding with the shock of what she believed she had discovered. She didn't wait for more. Sometimes, it only takes a single spark for suspicion to ignite into certainty. Fear mixed with opportunity as she hurried away from the kitchen. In a house where information shifted power, even a hint of impropriety could be used to gain favor or protection. She didn't go straight to the master that night, but she whispered her suspicions to another servant she trusted. Whispers do not stay small for long in a place where survival depends on knowing more than one is meant to know. Rumors spread like wildfire in the dark, each retelling stretching the truth a little further, shaping the story into something more dangerous than the simple exchange it had been. By the next morning, the plantation seemed to hum with a quiet tension. Conversations halted when the wife or the cook entered a room. Eyes lingered on them longer than usual. The air felt charged, brittle, as though the house itself sensed the shift. It didn't take long for the rumor to reach someone bold enough or fearful enough to bring it to the master's attention. What began as a mere overheard whisper traveled through the household like a ghost searching for a place to haunt. The truth of what had been said no longer mattered. What mattered was how it was interpreted, twisted, and delivered. And once the master heard even a distorted version of that soft midnight conversation, suspicion blossomed into something far darker, something neither woman could escape. The moment of discovery did not come through a dramatic confrontation or a deliberate search, but through a twist of circumstance that neither woman could have foreseen. It was a night drenched in storm clouds, the kind that pressed low against the earth and made every shadow stretch longer than usual. The plantation owner had returned earlier than expected from a trip, his mind already troubled by the whispers that had begun circulating among the household staff. Though no one dared speak plainly, the fragments he gathered late nights in the kitchen, hushed voices, unusual closeness, formed a picture he could no longer ignore. His anger simmered beneath his skin, fueled by jealousy, by pride, and by the fear that his authority was being quietly undermined in his own home. As the house settled into nighttime stillness, he walked through the hallways, trying to clear his mind. But as he passed the staircase, he noticed a faint glow coming from the direction of the kitchen, far later than any servant should still be awake. At first, he assumed it was negligence, another sign of slipping discipline. But when he moved closer, he heard something, a soft laugh, quick and hushed, carrying a warmth he had not heard in his wife's voice in years. His breath caught. A cold, electric rage began tightening around his ribs. He approached the doorway with slow, deliberate steps, each one heavy with dread. The lantern inside flickered weakly, casting wavering light that danced across the walls. What he saw was not overt or scandalous in action, but it was enough to break something ancient and brittle inside him. The wife and the cook stood close, too close, speaking in low, intimate tones that held no distance, no fear, no formality. The wife reached out to brush something from the cook's sleeve, a small gesture but tender in a way that made the owner's world tilt violently out of place. It was the expression on her face, softened in a manner he had forgotten, that tightened his fists and burned into his memory. The women froze when they sensed his presence. The cook stepped back instinctively, her posture straightening, her eyes guarded. The wife's breath hitched, her face draining of color as she whispered his name. But the owner didn't reply. He stared at them both, his silence more dangerous than any shouted accusation could have been. In that moment, he was no longer a husband confused by his wife's distance. He was a man who believed he had been betrayed, humiliated, made a fool of in the one place where he held unquestioned power. Nothing explosive happened then, no harsh words, no immediate violence. But the weight of what he believed he had seen settled into his bones, darkening his thoughts, twisting his pride into fury. From that moment onward, the cook was no longer simply a servant in his household. She became the embodiment of his wounded ego, the source of his growing obsession with reclaiming control. The discovery was quiet, but its impact would ripple outward until it led them all toward tragedy. The confrontation that followed did not erupt immediately, but its presence grew like a gathering storm within the walls of the house. The plantation owner spent the hours after his discovery pacing through the dim corridors, unable to quiet the fury twisting inside him. Every breath reminded him of what he believed he had witnessed, his wife standing too close to the cook, her expression softened in a way he had not seen in years. The humiliation struck deeper than any physical wound could. His pride, already fragile from whispers he had tried to ignore, now felt shattered. By the time dawn threatened the edge of the sky, his anger had sharpened into something cold and deliberate. When he finally confronted his wife, he did so not out of a desire for truth but from a need to reassert control. He cornered her in the parlor, demanding explanations she could not give without revealing her heart. She tried to maintain her composure, insisting that he had misunderstood what he saw, but her trembling voice betrayed her fear. He studied her with narrowed eyes, seeing guilt not in her actions but in her inability to lie convincingly. Every moment she hesitated only deepened his conviction that something forbidden had taken root between her and the cook. His tone shifted from questioning to threatening, each word laced with the promise of consequences he knew would terrify her. Later that day, he turned his attention to the cook. He summoned her with a voice that carried the weight of unspoken doom. She entered the room with quiet dignity, though she sensed the danger immediately. He questioned her with a calculated cruelty, his words sharpened by resentment. She answered with calm restraint, refusing to cower, a steadiness that enraged him further. Her composure felt like defiance to a man who demanded obedience from those beneath him. His fury escalated as he imagined her influence over his wife, twisting it into a narrative that fed his worst suspicions. When he finally lost control, it wasn't with a blow but with a threat so chilling it left both women shaken. He promised to destroy the cook's life if she dared step near his wife again. He threatened to send her away in chains, to punish her in ways that would ensure she never forgot her place. Then he turned on his wife, making it clear that her reputation, her standing, even her safety depended on severing every tie she had formed with the cook. His voice trembled with rage as he warned that he would not be made a fool of, not in his own home, not by the woman he owned or the wife he believed owed him loyalty. The confrontation left the household steeped in fear. Neither woman slept that night. They both understood that the fragile connection they had cherished had become a spark inside a dry field, and the man whose pride they had wounded would stop at nothing to extinguish it. The plan to escape was born not from impulse but from steadily mounting fear, the kind that settles into the bones and refuses to loosen its grip. After the confrontation with the plantation owner, the cook understood that staying meant certain suffering, possibly even death. The wife, shaken by the cruelty in her husband's voice and the hatred in his eyes, knew she had pushed them all to the edge without intending to. She spent the following night in restless silence, listening to the wind scrape against the shutters and the old floorboards creak beneath invisible footsteps. Every sound felt like a warning. Every shadow appeared to carry her husband's anger. By dawn, she understood that the cook could not remain under her roof and survive. The idea of escape terrified her, yet the thought of doing nothing terrified her more. She knew the plantation better than anyone, its hidden corners, unused rooms, and forgotten paths behind the smokehouse where the ground dipped into a shallow ravine. When she was a young girl, she used to explore those woods with an innocence long gone. Now those same paths offered the only chance for the cook's survival. The wife stole moments throughout the day to study her husband's movements, noting when he spoke with the overseer, when he checked the fields, when he walked into town. Every gap in his routine became a thread she could use to stitch together a plan. Her heart ached when she approached the cook that night. The kitchen was dark except for a small candle flickering on the table, casting trembling shadows on the walls. The cook sensed something heavy in the wife's expression before a word was spoken. When the wife finally whispered the idea, running, slipping through the woods, reaching the river, the cook's breath caught. She had dreamed of freedom, but dreaming and risking everything were not the same. Still, she saw the truth in the wife's eyes. Staying meant more suffering. Leaving meant danger, but also a sliver of hope. They spoke quietly, mapping each step with painstaking care. They would wait until the deepest part of the night, when the wind rustled loud enough to mask footsteps and the household slept heavily. The wife promised to bring a small bundle of food, a cloak, and a lantern with just enough oil to reach the tree line. Her hands trembled as she described the hidden trail behind the smokehouse, the one her husband rarely approached. The cook listened with silent determination, though sadness lingered in her gaze, knowing this meant leaving behind the one person who had shown her warmth in a place built on cruelty. The plan was fragile, held together by desperation and love, but it was the only hope they had. Neither woman spoke of what might happen if they were caught. The thought hung unspoken in the air, heavy and cold, but they both understood the truth. The escape would have to succeed, because failure meant the end of everything they still dared to feel. The night of the tragedy unfolded under a sky churning with restless clouds, the kind that seemed to press the world into a suffocating hush. The plantation had fallen silent, its usual creaks and murmurs drowned beneath the weight of the impending storm. The wife waited in her room, every heartbeat echoing in her ears as she listened for signs that her husband had settled into sleep. When she finally dared to move, she did so with trembling hands and breath so shallow she feared it would betray her. She gathered the small bundle she had prepared, bread, dried fruit, a water skin, and the cloak she hoped would keep the cook warm in the woods. Each step down the staircase felt heavier than the last, as though the house itself tried to warn her to turn back. The cook was already waiting in the shadows near the kitchen door, her figure barely visible in the faint glow of the moon. Her eyes met the wife's with a mixture of resolve and sorrow, knowing this was their only chance. They exchanged no tender words, no promises, only a silent understanding that the moment they stepped beyond the boundaries of the plantation, everything would change. Together, they slipped out into the humid night, moving carefully along the path behind the smokehouse. The air smelled of damp earth and lightning, thick with the tension of what was to come. But the plantation owner had not been asleep. Whether he had suspected something or the storm made him restless, something had driven him from bed. When he noticed his wife's absence beside him, his anger surged anew. He stormed through the house, his instincts sharpening as he caught sight of the cracked back door and the faint flicker of movement near the trees. Rage propelled him forward. His steps were heavy, fast, fueled by a bitter mix of betrayal and wounded pride. By the time he reached the smokehouse, he could hear the whispers of the two women ahead, soft and hurried. He called out, his voice booming through the darkness, stopping them cold. The wife turned, fear slicing through her as she saw him charging toward them. The cook grabbed her arm, urging her to run, but the ground was muddy, slick from the rising storm. The owner reached them within moments, his fury erupting in shouted accusations. He lunged for the cook first, his fingers gripping her arm with brutal force. She tried to pull away, slipping in the mud, and the wife rushed between them, begging him to stop. The struggle became chaotic, their bodies clashing in the darkness as thunder cracked overhead. In the chaos, the owner shoved the cook harder than he intended. Her foot slid on the wet slope near the ravine, and she fell backward, her body crashing onto the rocks below with a sickening thud. The world seemed to freeze in that moment. The wife's scream tore through the night, raw and broken, as she scrambled down the embankment, her hands shaking violently as she reached the cook's still form. The plantation owner stood motionless at the top of the slope, breathing hard, the reality of what he had done settling over him like a shroud. The storm broke then, rain pouring down in sheets as though the sky itself mourned what had been lost. And in that rain-soaked moment, the love the two women had fought to protect slipped away forever, leaving only grief and the terrible silence of a life stolen too soon. Here is *** key point number 10 explained in 450 words, without any subheadings and without an ending sentence ***. Key point number 10 revolves around the unsettling realization that the legacy of this family's choices did not simply fade with time but continued shaping how the community perceived them long after the events had passed. This point highlights how the consequences of secrecy, isolation, and generational patterns can leave marks deeper than any physical evidence, creating a quiet but persistent echo that lingers through history. It shows how people in small, tightly knit rural regions often carry memories across decades, passing stories from one generation to the next until they become a kind of folklore, half remembered, half exaggerated, but still rooted in some past truth. In this case, the family's history of internal marriages, hidden pregnancies, or tragedies resulting from those choices became something the townspeople whispered about but never openly confronted, allowing the narrative to grow more shadowed with each retelling. The key point emphasizes that the descendants, even those who had no involvement in what their ancestors did, ended up living with the weight of these rumors. They faced judgment not for their own actions but for the reputation created long before they were born. This section also explains how fear plays a major role in shaping such a legacy. People who lived nearby often avoided the family home or refused to interact too closely, not because they had evidence of danger, but because the idea of something being wrong with the lineage had already rooted itself in their minds. Over years, that fear hardens into belief, and belief turns into social isolation. Even long after the original family members had died, abandoned the area, or attempted to live normal lives, the stories attached to their name continued to follow them. It reflects how human nature gravitates toward sensational stories, especially those involving taboo subjects like inbreeding, secrecy, and hidden births. Such details tend to overshadow everything else, leaving the family forever defined by the most shocking parts of their past rather than anything they accomplished or endured. What makes this point so significant is that it reveals how history is not only recorded in documents or photographs but also in the collective memory of a community. Even when no official record remains, the emotional imprint survives in the stories people tell. This lasting reputation becomes almost like a curse, affecting how future generations are treated, where they can live, who they can marry, and how they are viewed by outsiders. The tragedy here is that many of these descendants grow up trying to escape a shadow they didn't create, yet everywhere they go, they find people who have already formed opinions based on tales passed down from parents or grandparents, making it difficult to build a life unconnected to the past.